I am Dorie Clark, and I am the one.
Welcome to I Am the One, Entrepreneur Edition, a show that explores the journeys of business owners who decided to be the one to make life better for the people they serve. I'm your host, Sonia Thompson, and today's guest is Dorie Clark. Dorie is a marketing strategy consultant, professional speaker, and frequent contributor to publications such as Forbes, Harvard Business Review, Entrepreneur, and Time. She's also the author of the books Reinventing You and Stand Out. We can learn so much from Dorie's experiences, in particular how she's learned to get her ideal clients to choose her. And that's what we're going to focus on today, specifically the strategies that she's picked up about how to stand out, that she wrote about in her book, Stand Out, and how you can use those same strategies to grow your business. All right, let's get to it. Here's Dorie. Hey, Dorie, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me, Sonia.
All right, it's my pleasure. Let's go ahead and dive right in. I want to go really in depth and talk more about your book, Stand Out, How to Find Your Breakthrough Idea and Build a Following Around It. I love this book, and I think it's super important for all entrepreneurs to read because standing out is essential. So before we dive in, I want to just kind of chat with you a little bit and find out more about why you wrote this book.
Well, I really wrote Stand Out because I wanted to solve a problem for myself, and I guess by extension, a lot of other people who are in a similar field or a similar place to me. I have a business as a marketing strategy consultant, and as I was building my business over the past 10 years, I realized that there's so much competition out there. I mean, there's so many people who are independent consultants, coaches, entrepreneurs, and I think in almost any field these days, especially because of globalization, and you know, we're having this conversation with you in South America, but because of globalization, the level of competition, just worldwide competition, has increased dramatically. If you're a web designer, let's say, you're no longer just competing with people in your town, you're competing across the world. And I really wanted to focus in on the question of, in this increasingly competitive, noisy society, how do you stand out? How do you get noticed? How do you make sure that you are the person that people choose rather than your competitors? And so I interviewed about 50 top thought leaders across a spectrum of different fields to try to answer that question, to understand how they were able to break through, and by extension, to create a sort of framework so that regular professionals could look at this and understand what they needed to do in order to make themselves get noticed in their field.
All right, and so what has been the results in your career as a result of answering this question and applying the framework in your own business?
Well, you know, when I look at my own career, I think about the early days of my business, and you know, I would spend a lot of times doing things like answering requests for proposals. You know, people would say, "Oh, well, we're talking to 5 different vendors. Why don't you send us your proposal?" And you know, you'd spend hours putting something together, and you'd just wait to be chosen. And for a lot of people, that's how it is. That's how they do business. And unfortunately, that's a huge waste of time. You know, these people sort of sit back, I get to choose. I'm the buyer. And then they make everybody prostrate themselves. And, you know, I didn't want to be in a situation like that. You're fundamentally in a weak defensive position when something like that happens. I wanted to be the person that people were fighting to have work for them. And so I needed somehow to turn the tables. And so I can say, thankfully, I have not submitted a competitive proposal, you know, literally in years. I mean, I'll submit a proposal to somebody if they want to work together so that we can hammer out the terms of the agreement. But, you know, these sort of cattle call, send in your proposal. I just don't do that. I tell people now literally like, nope, sorry, don't do it. So I have people come to me instead. And so, you know, that's the dynamic that I want to create in my business and that I would like for other people to have.
How long did it take you, like once you started down the journey of finding this path and applying the framework, how long did it take you for things to start happening, unfolding in this manner where people started to come to you instead of you having to sort of pitch yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not an overnight process. And I
Okay.
think this is the thing that frustrates some people, because the truth is, what I think really separates the winners from the losers in this equation is that you have to spend quite a while doing this, sort of
Okay.
toiling in the wilderness. And at first, you don't know if it's working. You are not getting evidence that it's working. Because it's not like you write one article and then somebody calls you up and says, "Oh, this is so brilliant. Come,
Right.
please, let me pay you $20,000 to give a speech." That doesn't happen. What happens instead is that you start putting your ideas out. You start putting your content out there, positioning yourself as more of a thought leader by sharing your ideas through some of the various mechanisms we talk about in Stand Out. And over time, your name becomes more familiar to people.
Okay.
And first it's like, "Oh yeah, I've heard of you, I think." And then it's like, "Oh yeah, I know just who you are." And then it's like, "Oh, we have to get her." And it just goes in that order. But it does take a while. And so for me, I would say it took me probably about, and it's embarrassing that it took this long, but it really took me about maybe 3 to 4 years
Okay.
after starting my business
Okay.
to get very serious about content creation,
Okay.
which is the thing that is necessary. I mean, you can't be known for your ideas if you don't share your ideas.
Okay.
And so it wasn't until quite a ways into my business that I started really blogging aggressively and doing that sort of thing. That's what ultimately enables you to leverage your ideas and grow exponentially. Before that, I mean, I was certainly growing my business. I had built a pretty reasonably successful 6-figure business locally, but it was through direct sales. Essentially, it was word of mouth for my consulting services. Whereas if you are creating thought leadership material and spreading it, then now you have a national audience, or the potential for a national or an international audience.
Got it. Got it. No, I think that's a good distinction, that this isn't an overnight strategy, or maybe even a strategy that'll get you where you want to be maybe in a month, but it's something that you have to commit to over time. All right, so we're going to dive more into the framework, but you mentioned a couple of objections that people might have to starting down this path. Are there any other objections that are common that you've heard from folks on why they might be a little leery about starting down the path towards differentiating themselves in this manner?
Well, there's plenty of objections that that people might have. I mean, one is, well, what if I don't like to write? And what I would say to that is that it's not about writing per se.
Okay.
I mean, you don't literally have to write. If you like that, if you want to, great. And that I actually happen to like writing, so that's sort of the thing that I've doubled down on. But even even things like this, doing podcasts, doing videos, that's a perfectly legitimate way of creating thought leadership. You can do interviews, you can have your own video series. I mean, you think about people who are extraordinarily successful, like Michelle Phan, who's a makeup and fashion vlogger. And she does these very elaborate videos and has built a huge following, with just multi-million-dollar revenue now. That's somebody who was not writing her way to success, but
Right.
it's about sharing your ideas, whatever the vehicle is.
Okay.
I think that's the first one. The other one that people might say is, "Oh, there's just already so much content. If I'm doing this, well, is anyone going to pay attention? Has the ship sailed? Has the horse left the barn?" And what I would say to that is, I mean, yes, there's a lot of content, but there's going to be more tomorrow, and there's going to be more next year. The sooner you get in, the better. And if your content is actually really good, A, it will get noticed, but B, it doesn't have to be noticed by 10,000 people. That's not the objective. It's not that you have to become a household name. It's that you need to become a household name to your targeted audience.
Okay.
And that's the crucial distinction. I mean, yeah, it would be very hard to break through and become as famous as, Justin Bieber or something like that. But if you're a business professional, that really doesn't have to be your goal. What ought to be your goal is, oh, well, I want to be the, whatever, the accountant of choice for people in the lawn and garden industry.
Right.
You know what? That's a lot more attainable. That's very doable. You can do that in a hyper-targeted fashion.
For sure. Now, have you come across any sort of niche field where standing out in this manner isn't beneficial?
Well, I think the biggest distinction that you hear sometimes is a cultural one.
Okay.
I sometimes will hear on Twitter, I'll be talking about my book or whatever, and I'll get a message from somebody, let's say in the UK or in Australia or whatever, and they'll always be like, oh, no one in my country wants to stand out. I'm like, well, okay, fair enough. But and I think, of course, individuals have different thoughts and preferences about that. But, generally, the United States is recognized as being the most pro-personal branding culture in the world. And so even people who maybe don't feel comfortable standing out, they know they should.
Okay.
So they're like, oh, okay, I guess I need to study this. But yeah, culturally, it's sort of this question of, the individual versus the group, and how do you do that? How do you navigate that in a positive way without looking like some kind of a braggart or a blowhard?
Right.
And I really want to emphasize that it's important. When we talk about standing out, I think sometimes people think that necessarily equates to some kind of chest thumping or, oh, I'm so great. Let me tell you why I stand out. That's not good personal branding. I mean, no one, even in the United States, likes that or appreciates that.
Right.
When we're talking about standing out, it is understanding what your distinctions and differences are. It's getting clear on what you can bring to the table and then manifesting that. And it's the least part is about what you say about yourself. It's about how you act. It's about how you live. It's about how you contribute. And so I would be hard pressed to find, I think, any culture where they'd say, oh no, really what we want is more conformity in the corporate world. What we really need is more yes men who all think alike and who all say the same thing. I mean, I think we have seen the limits of that. And I think that most cultures and most companies are increasingly realizing that we need different perspectives if we're actually going to have innovation, if we're actually going to be able to break into new markets successfully and see problems in different ways.
Got it. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into how someone goes about beginning this process of standing out. So you have maybe a 3-part framework within your book. And the first one is all about really discovering what it is that you want to be known for. And you have a couple of different ways that people can go about doing that. And the first one is establishing a big idea. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so if you are going to stand out in your company or in your field, fundamentally, if you are a knowledge worker, quote unquote, a white collar professional, what you are going to be known for is your ideas. That is the currency that we deal with in the business world. But the problem, and there is kind of this fundamental problem, is that ideas are pretty ineffable. I mean, unless someone has worked directly with you, elbow to elbow on a project, it is very hard for them to know with certainty if you are any good. They might know that they like you or that you're a nice person, but are you any good at what you do? Mm-hmm. That's what they need to know if they're going to feel comfortable hiring you.
Right.
And so that's tricky. So the reason that it's so important to have ideas that you're known for is that begins to show people, oh, she really is thinking about this. She is thoughtful. She's knowledgeable. She's well informed. I like how she thinks.
Got it.
And so I think sometimes people get a little hung up because they say, well, I don't have any, big breakthrough ideas. What do I do? That's great for other people, but I can't contribute. Mm-hmm. But one of my favorite parts of Stand Out is actually talking about a guy named Daniel Goleman, who is, his name is less well known than his concept. He was the author of the book Emotional Intelligence, which came out in the 1990s. It spent 5 years, literally, on the New York Times bestseller list. It was enormously popular. And I researched him to sort of look up, like, where did this idea come from? How did he end up propounding it? And I guess I had always assumed that he was a researcher of some kind and was writing about his research, but it turns out that is actually not true.
Okay.
Daniel Goleman was a reporter, and he discovered the concept by reading a psychology journal and reading this article, this kind of boring, dry academic article, where he read this and he said, "Oh my gosh, this is huge. This is really big." But it was never going to get recognized if somebody didn't popularize it and translate it in a way that was intelligible and interesting for the masses. And so that's what he did. He was a synthesizer. He was a talent spotter or an idea spotter. And I think that's something that really all of us can do.
Right. Right. So I like this idea that the big idea doesn't always have to be your idea.
Yeah.
It can just
exactly.
it can be your idea, but it can also be how you communicate another idea that isn't sort of well known or established or popularized.
You can be a champion of the underappreciated.
Got it. Got it. And as you start to do that, like, do you have to prepare yourself to sort of bang down doors? Like, if your big idea or the big idea that you want to champion is radically different from the status quo?
Yeah, I mean, if your idea is radically different, then it is possible that you will face some resistance. That was certainly the case with somebody that I profiled in Stand Out. His name is Eric Schott, and he today is one of the world's most successful scientists. But he had actually a lot of trouble early in his career because he was trained as a mathematician and a computer scientist, and he later moved into biology. And so with his quantitative training, he was able to see the potential for big data and quantitative analysis in a way that most classically trained biologists were not. And so he was advocating all these ideas, and they would look at him and say, what is this? This isn't biology. This isn't how we do things. And so for quite a while, he got a lot of resistance. He told me when I interviewed him for Stand Out about a story. He was speaking at Columbia, and literally a senior professor, tenured professor in the department, stood up in the middle of his talk and said, I don't think anyone should listen to this guy. And he walks out in the middle of the talk.
Wow.
So definitely the forces can be arrayed against you. But you know what? If you really do have a good idea, if you persevere, this is now 15-ish years later, it's like, who has the last laugh? I mean, big data is everywhere.
Got it.
And you would be hard-pressed to find somebody who would say, oh, yeah, big data, who cares about that? People realize that this has transformative potential, and Eric has a 15-year head start applying it in science, which means that he has been the author of a huge number of breakthroughs and more than 200 peer-reviewed papers that have really set the tenor for what's possible.
Got it. Oh, I love that. Like the way that you can blaze trails, there might be a little bit of resistance on one end when you get started, but yeah, it can make a big difference on the other side if you kind of stick with it. All right. So that's the big idea. And the next one is kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. It's all about sort of becoming the big fish in a small pond, really being the go-to authority in a narrow niche. How should someone go about doing that? And do they have to go super, super, super small, and do they have to stay there over time?
Yeah. So when it comes to finding a niche that you want to own, I mean, I think that sometimes, and I certainly class myself in this department, but there can be a lot of resistance because if you're kind of a Renaissance person, you say, oh, I don't want to box myself in. I don't want to do this little thing. I'm interested in so many things. And it can be sort of painful to have to choose. But the thing that I like to tell people is, look, you don't have to choose a niche strategy, but if you do, recognize that this is not a permanent state of affairs.
Okay.
This is about choosing your entry point,
Okay.
and then you expand from your entry point. And so how do you choose that entry point? Well, really it's about where is the competition, and how can you, if you apply yourself, stake a claim to something new. Mm-hmm. So for instance, if somebody said, oh, I'm going to become an expert in technology. Well, you know what? That technology means a lot of things, right? Like literally off the bat, I'd say, okay, well, technology, great. That could be mobile phones and mobile computing. That could be wearables. That could be self-driving cars. That could be, televisions. It could be VR. I mean, that's way too much. So you don't want something that's so broad. You also don't want something that is so narrow, frankly, that no one cares. So that's the other extreme. But if you can find a sweet spot, and something that you really could impact. I mean, the way that I like to think of it is, if you were to make a commitment to blog about some aspect of this topic once a day for 2 months, could you in fact become a world authority in that? And I am willing to bet that for a lot of topics, that actually is very attainable. Okay. If you can imagine, what would happen if you did 60 posts about a specific topic, that begins to rise up in the rankings pretty well. Right. So for instance, you could choose some facet. I mean, even VR, virtual reality is pretty big at this point, but let's say you picked a company. Let's say it was, Magic Leap or something like that. You could become, it's interesting enough because they're, probably going to be a player. You could become the Magic Leap expert. Got it. And then, when something happens, when they get acquired, when they go public, when they launch a new product, what do reporters do? Well, they're going to
call you, yeah.
And they'll call you, they'll say, oh my God, she's written 60 posts about this. All right, let's call her up.
Right, for sure. Okay. Oh, the next one that you had on here was more about providing new research. Or providing some form of research on a particular topic. Now, should people start going out and creating surveys and creating their own original research? Is this more of the idea that you had in mind with this one?
Well, original research can mean a lot of things. Okay. For instance, we're just talking a minute ago about, doing like 60 blog posts about a particular topic. Right. That's a form of original research. Mm-hmm. But I would say, one guy that I profiled in Stand Out is a guy named Michael Waxenberg. Okay. And he actually was able to build a career totally unexpectedly as a realtor because he and his family were house hunting. Okay. And instead of just kind of keeping his opinions to himself, what he did was he decided he wanted to try to help other people. So he would take very meticulous notes about these open houses, and he would post them on a website. Mm-hmm. And he kept doing it. He visited a lot of houses. He wrote a lot of reviews. And before too long, people actually wrote to him and said, oh, your reviews are so great. I'd love to have you represent me. And he was like, what? He wasn't a realtor. It never occurred to him. But so many people actually approached him asking. He was like, okay. And he got his real estate license. So, your form of research, it's really just about what can you contribute that is new and original to the discourse. Okay. So it could be doing interviews. It could be doing reviews. It could be doing a survey. Just, literally like what is it that you can tell people that they'd say, wow, I haven't heard that before. I haven't seen that before.
Got it. So it's more of uncovering new information that people didn't know. It's not about statistical analysis and standard deviations. And it could be if you wanted it to be, but it doesn't have to be that.
Indeed.
Okay. All right. We don't want to scare anybody away with the math stuff. All right. So what about seeing ideas in a new way?
Yeah. So there, I think that's one of the things that is important when it comes to developing breakthrough ideas is recognizing that that oftentimes really great ideas, sometimes the best ideas, are often right in front of us. But we are so distracted, we're so, cell phone addled or whatever, that we're just not taking the time to make the connections. And so I actually tell the story in Stand Out of a woman named Rose Schumann, who was able to develop a very innovative idea for what has become a successful NGO operating in Africa and India to help the world's poorest people. And it was inspired literally by her wandering around town one day and looking at a call box, like a transit call box where you push a button and you ask somebody a question. And, we've all seen those a million times. But she saw it in a new way, and she looked at it and she said, wait a minute, people have been trying to figure out this question of how do you bring the internet to the world's poorest people? And, they're coming up with all these like expensive, complicated solutions. She said, what if we put a call box in their village? And it turns out that's actually worked marvelously. And that's what she's been working on ever since.
Very cool. All right. And the last one that you had here on the list is about creating a framework, which of course is what you've done with your book. But how what does that look like? And how should people begin to go about doing that? Is it something that you can just say, all right, I'm going to make this framework and you can do it in an hour and 2 days, or is there more of a process associated with doing that?
Yeah. So, a framework is not necessarily something that I would recommend for everybody, but in certain circumstances, it could be very powerful. And that is, if there's a certain facet of expertise that you have in your field, in your industry, and you realize that there is actually a system to doing something well, or a system to success, but it hasn't been articulated before, if you do that, people are going to be, they're going to flip out. They're going to be saying, wow, oh, that's amazing. And, you think about the things that are famous frameworks. I think about like Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs. Like, it is not rocket science in any way to say, gosh, you know what? Before we can worry about our existential fulfillment, we really need to feed people. Like that needs to come first. That's okay, great. I could have told you that. But the fact that he was able to put it into this framework, the hierarchy of needs, where he said, all right, well, there's the physical ones of hunger and thirst and whatever. And then you go, up the ladder, belonging and affiliation and meaning and, and you lay it out. It's like, oh, it's such an organized framework. It makes so much sense. And then, people are able to refer to that, and a concept that was a little bit nebulous before all of a sudden becomes clear. And every time it gets talked about, Abraham Maslow gets mentioned.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, I think, and I guess it comes from sort of immersing yourself into your field and your craft and being open to how things sort of evolve. And then we're like, oh, you see something in a new way. And it's just a matter of sort of putting it out there for other people to be able to grasp and latch on very easily.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so that wraps up really the first part of ways in which you can go about standing out. Now I guess it's time to move into phase 2, which is more about getting known for your ideas. So what would you say is the first step for someone to do that? You mentioned blogging. Is that where somebody should go through in terms of getting their ideas out into the world and having other people associate the idea with them?
Blogging is a great way to share and spread your ideas, but I would actually posit that it is a good second step rather than a good first step. And so the first step, which I think is often overlooked because it's a little bit more hidden, it's a little less visible, is actually assembling a trusted group of advisors around you. That is what I would call a useful prerequisite, because prior to just throwing your ideas out into the world, I have found in interviewing these 50 top thought leaders and really trying to break down their methods, what is very common is that they have, you can call it a mastermind group or a personal board of directors or something like that, but a group of people around them that they trust and who can give them honest feedback that they really take in and take to heart. That enables you to make your ideas better. And, before you launch them to the public, And also, they oftentimes provide critical early support or advice or access to their networks. So assembling that group is first.
Okay.
Number two is then sharing your ideas more broadly with people that don't already know you.
Okay.
And I call that building an audience. And so blogging might be one form, podcasting, maybe doing a summit, or doing videos. It could be giving public speeches. Any of those methods of just connecting with people who are the broader public. And then the third and final step that I talk about is what I call building a community.
Okay.
And that is where when your idea has begun to take off, when you have a little bit of momentum, when you're beginning to build an audience, then you're actually able to bring your audience together around your idea.
Okay.
So maybe that's organizing a conference, maybe it's creating an online community, something like that. But it enables people who are your fans essentially to meet and connect with each other around your idea. And that strengthens and solidifies the bond, and it helps it spread.
Got it. And it makes the idea, it's bigger, it's sort of becoming bigger than you at that point.
Correct.
All right. So one of the questions that I have around spreading your idea, I think a lot of people, they hear blog, they hear podcasting, they're like, yeah. But like there are 50 million people on Facebook. Like I can go on Facebook or I can go on Twitter and start sharing that way. Do you have an opinion on whether or not someone needs to spread their ideas through an asset they own versus like on a social platform, or does that not really matter as much?
Well, I think that social media is certainly a very useful channel to tap.
Okay.
I think it's an important thing for people to be active on at least some social channels these days. But I wouldn't necessarily make it my primary base.
Okay.
Because the truth is, and people knew this intellectually before, but really starting in 2013, at the end of 2013, Facebook tweaked its algorithms. And people freaked out because it was the first time they had actually seen, like, oh, God, they can do this, which is that for a lot of brands who had pages, their ability literally overnight to reach their audience that they had spent so much time building and cultivating just got dramatically scaled back. And Facebook's like, oh, sorry, we need to earn some money from this. So now you have to pay us for that thing that we used to give you for free. And you do put yourself at the mercy of other people. So I would say, yeah, absolutely. Build your audience using social media. Use it as a an arrow in your quiver. But if that's the only card you're playing, then it's risky.
Got it. And then the third part was you said building community around your ideas so other people can connect with each other. Is there a critical mass that you would say people need to have in their building their audience part of it before they should start thinking about the community aspect of it? Well,
I think you will likely begin to know when it's time to build your community because the evidence that I would see is that your audience is going to start taking steps to connect themselves and build their own community. And when you start to see that level of excitement where they're like, oh, but I really want to meet other people who are interested in getting things done so that we can compare notes on how we label our file folders. Or, when you start to see that level of desire to talk with other people about it or meet other people, then you can sort of watch what they do and learn from that. But you can also say, all right, well, maybe I can, help them, or maybe I can steer these efforts a little bit by creating a structure to enable them to connect.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, let's move into the third phase of your framework, which is all about making it happen. So, we're talking to entrepreneurs here, and they are trying to make sure that they're building and growing their business. So how do they make their thought leadership work for them in their business? Is it something that's a natural progression, or do you really need to be intentional about making this aspect of it materialize?
Well, I do think it's important to be intentional. And part of the reason for that is that especially these days, with the fact that, good news, right? Everybody can create content. Everybody can share, sans gatekeeper. The bad news of that is that because that is now allowed through social media, we have these channels, you're not getting any money for that. And so you could, I mean, it is an entirely conceivable situation that you could be writing and tweeting and whatever, podcasting 24 hours a day. You could build up a pretty big following. You could even become a kind of thought leader and not make any money.
Right.
Because if you just kept doing these free activities, people will gladly take it. They'll say, "Oh, wonderful, thank you."
Right.
But you're not getting anything out of it, and it quickly becomes unsustainable unless you have a trust fund. So you have to think. Everybody who does not have a trust fund has to really ask the question. All right, well, what's the mix? And the mix is going to vary depending where you are in your career. It's going to vary depending on just what your personal needs and situation are.
Okay.
But what is the mix between the free content that draws people in and the paid content, which enables it to become sustainable for you?
Okay. Is there a point at which, should you be focusing more so on building your audience and establishing yourself before you start thinking about how to monetize it? Or is there sort of like a tipping point where it's time to go and monetize and to capitalize on what you've been able to create?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I think about it is that early in your career, and this doesn't necessarily correlate to your age, but it correlates to whatever you're doing. If you've switched careers or whatever, early on, you want to spend a disproportionate amount of time doing brand building.
Okay.
And the reason, and essentially what I mean by that is free brand building. Because if people don't know who you are, then, clearly they're going to be pretty reluctant to hand over money in any form.
Right.
So the investment that you make, however, in early brand building, it does compound over time. It does mean that people later on will be more willing to do business with you at higher levels.
Okay.
So I mean, I think so as we are filming this, Prince just died,
Right.
and so you think about Prince, right? He was most famous, at the height of his popularity, literally over 30 years ago. 1984 was when he was at the peak of his popularity, but literally up until last week, he was performing and giving very popular sold out concerts. Mm-hmm. That's not because of things that he's necessarily done in the past 30 years. It's because he's built this enormous brand equity, and people, who have known about him and heard about him, and they might not have been paying attention since Little Red Corvette, but they say, "Oh yeah, I love Prince. He's cool. Yeah, sure, I'll pay $75 for a ticket. I'll pay $300 for, a really good seat. No problem." And I think that those are the kinds of benefits that over time, if we invest early on, we can reap later.
For sure. And I think that's a really good way of looking at it. Like you plant all your seeds now, and that there's a grand harvest that doesn't necessarily have to have a limit to what you're able to accomplish later on. So cool.
Yeah.
All right. So there are a couple of audience questions that I fielded in preparation for this session with you. So I want to just kind of bring a few of those up. So the first one comes from Eileen Purdy, and she wants to know if you have any tips on speaking on a topic other than just good old practice. So tips for becoming better.
Okay. How do you become a better speaker?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, practice is useful. Mostly, I would say, I mean, it's nice for a lot of reasons, but where it's mostly useful is actually learning to desensitize yourself to it.
Okay.
Because almost everybody, when they first start out with this, new behavior where they're in front of an audience, you're going to get a racing heart. And that is going to impede your ability to perform well because you're sort of in this panic mode. It's like, how could I think? Because, your heart is racing,
right.
and you have a lot of stress. And so the more you can desensitize yourself so that it's like, whatever, then you can actually be really comfortable and excel at it. But besides that, I mean, I just gave a speech last night. And in fact, I gave 3 speeches plus 1 webinar this week. That was my work week. Which is not at all uncommon. So I think about things that I've done to try to, give better speeches. One, I would say, is if you are using a PowerPoint, I mean, dear God, please, I hope people know this already, but don't have a lot of text on the slides. It's terrible. Really, what I do is I have a big picture, maybe a couple words, and then I tell a story about it. And that is my methodology, and I think people seem to like that because you will lose them if you have a lot of words because they'll start reading the slide and they'll stop paying attention to you. And you can't afford that. You've got to hold their attention. I think another thing that's really useful is with audience Q&A, there's going to be fairly consistent questions that you're going to be experiencing if you are talking about the same subject. And so it's worth it for you in advance to try to create your own list of frequently asked questions, let's say the top 10 or something like that, so that you are prepared for them. And I mean, of course, there might be like a totally random question, how does this apply to Dalmatians? And, you'll have to sort of make it up on the fly. But for most of the common ones, you'll be able to sound pretty smart because you have planned it out in advance. I think that's what's pretty useful. I mean, another tip for sounding better with a speech is making sure that the people introduce you properly so that you're entering the stage with a proper level of gravitas. And that can be done, really just by sending them your bio before. They should be organized enough to have done this themselves, but oftentimes people are not. And so you send them the bio or you bring them the bio so that they have it.
Very cool and practical tips. All right, so the next question comes from Katie Joy. And she wants to know, how do you establish yourself as a thought leader? And this is within, I guess, whenever you're working for somebody else, within a franchise where technically you're following the values and guidance of someone else, the person who's the leader, but you work independently.
Yeah. So for something like this, I think that it's important to kind of think about your brand as a little bit of a Venn diagram, right? Like if we picture the overlapping circles. So there are going to be certain areas of the circle where your brand and their brand overlap really well, and that's like, okay, there's a corporate value that you really value too. Fantastic. That's helpful. Inside the organization, you can absolutely drive that. You can be like, yes, integrity, that's my thing, and whatever. There's also going to be things outside the circle that you have that the company brand doesn't. Those are the things that I would at least for now within this context, I would, not like silence them or whatever, but I wouldn't play them up because it doesn't help you in the if it's too far away from what the company culture is. But I think that what I would suggest is that you also, as you're positioning yourself externally, with clients, with other people, think about areas that you have, your own values, and just find small and subtle ways to distinguish yourself. So this would be things that are not anathema to your company's values, but just are things maybe that they don't talk about or that they don't do. They'd be fine with it, but it's just not what they're known for. And then that's what you make yourself known for. To the extent that you can do that, then you can begin to carve out your own individual and distinct brand.
Okay. All right. And the last question is more about once you establish yourself as a thought leader, but then you need help with something, how do you go about searching out other experts to help you? Because I guess sometimes people have a certain expectation of you as an expert in your own right. Like, does that change how you go about seeking assistance and expertise from other people?
Well, this is actually a fabulous question because I can answer it in a couple of ways. Number one, if you actually have legitimately established yourself as a thought leader, this makes everything easier because people who are experts in other realms already will want to talk to you because like congregates with like. I mean, why is it that we see, just to pick a fantastic example, I don't even remember which one, but one of the Kardashians, maybe multiple Kardashians, married NBA players. Like, how does that happen? Well, it's because the Hollywood elite marries the sporting elite. Or, people in Hollywood, marry politicians. You get Maria Shriver and Arnold Schwarzenegger, like these kind of things that like, wow, that's that's weird, but it's not weird because it's the top people seeking the top people out. So it's actually great because if you are recognized as a top person, people who do other top things will want to be your friend. And, let's say you're an expert in Facebook marketing and they, so these people will be coming to you and maybe someone's an expert in Twitter marketing, and you can actually, it's fine to say, you know what, I know a lot about Facebook. I actually know nothing about Twitter. Maybe we can trade tips. Maybe you can help me.
Right.
And they'll probably be really glad to do it. So I think, that's the first piece. And the second piece is that actually, I think what people fail to recognize is that if you already have a reputation as someone who knows what they're talking about, you actually gain points if you are honest about things that you don't know. People respect that. It's a sign of confidence. If somebody uses a word in conversation that I don't know, I will ask them. I'll be like, hey, wait, what does that mean? And I don't think people are going to think that I'm stupid. I mean, I've written books. I went to Harvard, blah, blah, blah. Who cares? It's insecure people that don't ask because, oh God, if they realize I don't know what such and such means, they'll think I'm a fraud. And, I feel fine not knowing things. And I think the more we're all fine with not knowing things, the more confident we will appear. And the more, in fact, people will respect us. And, they will take it seriously when we say, well, I don't know a lot about this, but I do know a lot about this. And they'll say, oh, okay, well, I trust her because she's honest.
Right. Super cool. Super cool. Dorie, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to share some insights into your book. And I will have a link in the show notes for everyone so they know how they can go and get it and read it to get all the other goodness into it.
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, for people who want to dive even deeper on my site, DorieClark.com, there's a free 42-page workbook that they can download. So I appreciate your linking to that. And if folks want to do it, it's DorieClark.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Dorie.
Thanks. Take care.
All right. Dorie had so many great things to share, and I want to make sure that you're ready to take the next step forward to get noticed in your field of work. And that brings us to today's I Am the One challenge. Based upon what you know today, what can you start work on right now to begin establishing yourself as a thought leader? And to help you along with this, what specific topic could you create 60 unique pieces of valuable content for, be it blog posts, podcasts, videos, whatever, to be published over the next 60 days? Now, once you've got your answer, go ahead and drop it in the comments below. I want to hear all about how you are going to start establishing yourself as a thought leader so your ideal clients start to seek you out. Until next time, keep working on building your dream business so you can make life better. Somebody's waiting on you. See you soon.